Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the original owners of the land on whose the original owners of the land on which the university and where our audience and our participants are all based. This land was never ceded, and we respect the traditions of their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today, it's a great pleasure to have the first of three webinars on class in the Communist Party of China. We're starting first with the Peasant Class, and the speaker, of course, is Professor Yingjie Guo from the University of Sydney. And the moderator for all three of these webinars will be Professor Kam Louie. It's a great pleasure to have both of them on board for this event. I've known them for years, and I'm very touched that they've agreed to do this. So over to you first, Kam, to introduce Professor Guo.
Great. Hello, everyone. Well, thanks, David, for that introduction. I'm really honored to be able to chair this session. Yingjie is not only a good friend, but an insightful scholar who has interesting things to say. Professor Guo is currently Professor of Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney and a Fellow of the Australian Humanities Academy. Before coming to Australia, he was a lecturer at Shanghai International Studies University and has since held teaching positions at the University of Technology, Sydney, the University of Tasmania, and the University of New England. He's a leading scholar of cultural politics in contemporary China, who has made major contributions to the scholarship on Chinese nationalism, the cultural politics of national identity, and the discourse of class in Post-Mao China. His 2003 book, Cultural Nationalism in Contemporary China, The Search for National Identity Under Reform, is widely regarded in the field as having inspired theoretically informed distinctions between varieties of nationalism, leading to more conceptual clarity and more nuanced understandings of this important ideology and construct. He's continuing to research and publish in these fields, publishing in recent years the books Local Elites in Post-Mao China and Handbook on Class and Social Stratification in China, and numerous articles about class and culture in top academic journals. Today, we're fortunate to have Professor Guo speak to us on an extremely important topic about the concept of class and how it relates to the way the peasantry has been described in China. The title of this paper is The Peasant Class Under the Impact of Industrialization, Urbanization, and Household Registration. Anyway, without further ado, let's hear from Professor Guo.
Thank you very much, Kam, and thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. As you can see on the screen, my title is The Peasant Class. Although on top of that, I have class and the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's the broad context within which I'm talking about the peasant class. And that's important to remember, because when one speaks of class and the Chinese Communist Party in the same breath, then it is necessary to go through Marxism, for example. All right, so I'm posing three general questions, and my focus will be on the third, although the third question can be reformulated in different ways. The first is why class? I need to say something about that because it is actually of a lot central significance to the books that we have just published. It is also important to say something about that in relation to the peasant class. My second question is sort of, you might think redundant, but you'll see what I mean. Is the peasantry a class? But the most important, so the talk will focus on that. What does the class mean to the Chinese Communist Party? When we begin to talk about the meaning of something, then that's where I take a different approach to things like class and nation and a range of things. So it is about the place of the Chinese peasantry in the CCP's general scheme of things. First up, why class? Well, the first thing is to say is class is central to Marxism and the identities of the CCP and PRC. Historical materialism, that's the social plank of Marxism, posits that class struggle drives social progress, propelling all human societies from primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism to socialism and communism. And class is also of central significance to Mao's Chinese Revolution, which is based on the idea that class antagonism goes on even after objective classes are eliminated. Now, I'm sure you have all seen this banner. The CCP calls itself a class organization or the vanguard of the Chinese proletariat. So the two symbols you see on the banner, the sickle and the hammer, represent two classes, the industrial proletariat and the peasantry. So class is right there in the banner. And when you look at the national flag, which really is not a national flag, but a state flag, you see 5 stars. Everybody knows the big star stands for the Chinese Communist Party. And then you have the 4 classes standing for representing 4 classes, although at least 2 of the classes have disappeared. The one on the top, once again, is the industrial proletariat, followed by the peasantry, followed by the petite bourgeoisie, finally the national bourgeoisie. When I ask my nephews, nieces in China, I mean, nobody knows which classes these refer to now. Right, the second question is the peasantry a class, not by Marx's or Engels' standards, because in their eyes, the peasantry is not a separate class, but part of the middle class. And Marx and Engels didn't really pay a lot of attention to the middle class for the simple reason that that class is not important in the general scheme of things. They didn't have a major role to play in social progress. Right? And according to Marx and Engels, a communist movement can only be led by the proletariat. Well, Marx and Engels' impression or perception of the peasantry isn't complementary. They compared the French peasants to a sack of potatoes. You can look at the small fine print when I'm talking, so I don't need to read out everything on the screen. Generally speaking, there's nothing positive about the peasantry, right? Pioneer communist leaders in China didn't use the same words, but they used very similar words to describe the peasants. Chen Duxiu in particular called the peasants all kinds of similar things that remind, well, one of those is unsophisticated and ignorant, and he also used conservative. Now, it's important, very important to mention this last point. In advanced capitalist societies, the peasantry as a whole will disappear. Where do they go? They'll sink into the proletariat. Now, that is going to pose, well, indeed, it posed a series of challenges and problems for the Chinese Communist Party when they tried to apply Marxism, especially Marxist class theory, to Chinese practices. Well, by 1927, when Chiang Kai-shek became the leader of the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, and began to crack down on the Chinese communists, CCP leaders had realized that the party could not follow Marxist revolutionary roadmap or the Russian example, where the industrial workers played a leading role in seizing state power. Now, one could argue that China's conditions in the 1920s and 30s, when the Chinese Communist Party began to become active, the conditions were not ripe for the Chinese Communist Party, for a communist revolution. Certainly the party argues that, right? That's why the party says we need to adapt, we need to synthesize Marxism to suit Chinese conditions and practices. Well, that's convenient. I would go much further than that and argue that it's probably not possible to find real classes corresponding to constructed or theoretical ideal types. And that's what Marx and Engels had. And imagine the Chinese Communist Party trying to find real classes on the ground that would correspond to the ideal types. They wouldn't find any. And one can even go further to say, can you find real classes that would answer to Marx's description in any society? I doubt it, right? So the party's reliance on the peasantry after 1927, that's, after all, that is a major hallmark of synthesized Marxism. I would call it a departure from Marxist class theory. And as I mentioned earlier, it posed a series of very difficult questions and challenges for the party to deal with. Now, this is my third question. What does class mean to the CCP? Meaning is much more complex. And this is really what I need to unpack during the rest of my talk. Now, the general point I'm making is that I shouldn't have picked. It gives the wrong impression that I'm right, other people are wrong. I hope you don't think that. The meaning of class does not exist objectively, but it's articulated. It's a simple point, but actually there's a lot to unpack, right? And what I mean by articulating doesn't simply mean saying something, but it also means putting it into practice. So I'm reminded of one thing that Bourdieu said. I think he understood something the Chinese Communist Party understood really well, and that is that classes are not objective realities. They don't exist out there independent of people's volition. On the contrary, classes become real groups, and as they are mobilized and organized, and at the cost of political work. So the importance of political work in creating classes and class struggle is of critical significance, and that's the bulk of the party's work. So a follow-up point to make is that if class is understood in that way, then it is not the same thing as objectivist or positive conceptions. And people often call that social interpretation. I'm not picking a fight with anybody, but I had quite a few sociologists who tried to pick a fight with me because they come from an objectivist and positivist kind of background. So these were the general points I would like to make at the very beginning, and I'm going to unpack those general points in the three contexts. We can consider this to be the three critical moments in the Chinese Revolution, certainly in the countryside. And the first stage, the first moment is the peasantry during the agrarian revolution and the land reform. The second is during Mao's socialist transition. And the third is during the post-Mao reform and opening up. So the meaning of the peasantry changed from each stage or from moment to moment. And the role of the peasantry also differed. Let's look at the peasantry during the first period, the agrarian revolution and land reform. Now, I'm really pointing out the obvious, but the obvious needs to be pointed out, I think, at the very outset. The revolution and reform centered on three things: the countryside, the peasantry, and land, right? You can see very easily that CCP's focus is already different from what Marx's class theory suggested, right? And the importance of the peasantry was made clear by Mao Zedong, who said the Chinese Revolution was a protracted rural-based and armed struggle. And the importance of the countryside, that's self-evident because it was the party's primary operational base, safe haven, and its sphere of influence. Now, Mao made a very important point when he was talking to Edgar Snow, who wrote Red Star of China in Yan'an in 1936, to highlight the importance of the peasants and the land to the Chinese Revolution. He said, whoever won over the peasants would prevail in China, and whoever resolved the land problem would win over the peasants, right? Poor peasants had a very indispensable role to play in the party's armed struggle because they were the bulk of the army, the military forces, and they also provided resources, right? And the land was a very precious, valuable commodity. It was something that party used as an incentive to attract the peasants, to win support, to attract them into the revolution, right? And the incentive for the peasants was also obvious: wealth, economic security, social prestige, and political power. All these things. And after 1949, land had additional meaning because it was part of China's rural economic base, and China's socialist translation was about transforming the economic base as well as the cultural moral superstructure. Well, all that is obvious, all that is easy to understand, right? But what did class and class struggle have to do with it? Were the agrarian revolution and the land reform inevitable consequences of the conflicts in the mode of production? Well, that's one thing that the Marxist class theory says, right? Classes are objective realities, and class struggle is an objective reality, and class struggle is inevitable, right? So the Chinese Communist Party actually followed that line. Another question one can ask is, was the CCP identified rural classes real classes? And was class struggle an objective reality, as the party asserted? So my short answer to all these questions is, to the three questions, is no. Why? Because, well, it is true that some peasants had land while others did not, and some had more than others. That was an obvious fact. But that does not mean that those who had the most land or were the exploiting classes. So exploitation has to be defined, it has to be articulated. And it doesn't mean either that those who did not have land or had the least were the exploited classes. Now, exploitation needs to be fixed. The meaning needs to be fixed. And the party did a lot of that. And the group boundaries had to be demarcated. And the party went to extreme lengths to do that. In fact, both, that is fixing the meaning of exploitation and demarcating the boundaries of groups, became a major part of the party's class mapping and class making practices, right? And even if existence of exploitation can be approved beyond doubt, it doesn't mean there is that class struggle is inevitable. For centuries, Chinese peasants sorted out their problems with rich peasants and landlords in different ways. There were peasant uprisings, peasant rebellions, but most of the time people sorted it out, the problems in different ways, right? Finally, whether to conduct a class struggle or not, and when to conduct class struggle, was a decision by the party. That's probably not so obvious. During the Second World War, the parties subordinated class struggle to national struggle. So the party basically saying, all right, China is invaded by Japan. We need to, stand together. It doesn't matter which class you're from. We must stand up. We must fight together to kick out the Japanese invaders. So classes now do not matter. In order to do all that, the party had to go through elaborate processes of class analysis. And what is the point of that? The point is, Mao once again made it very, very clear, is to separate friends from enemies, to have a very, very clear idea, who are our enemies, who are our friends, right? But it wasn't good enough to do just that, given the party's meta discourse was based on historical materialism, or the social plank of Marxism. And classes were regarded as subjects and objects of the revolution. Good classes are part of us, the bad classes are part of them that we need to defeat and suppress. And class struggle was treated as the driving force of the Chinese Revolution, in the same vein as historical materialism suggested, right? So what the party did was to map a historical materialist template onto Chinese society, literally, yeah? And labeled the friends and enemies as exploited and exploiting classes. So the two opposing camps. And on that basis, fermented class antagonism. Well, it found up antagonism where it existed. It actually created antagonism when there was very little. Certainly when it was not obvious. In this way, the party made classes and class struggle and constructed a reality, a new reality, and embedded a story of insurgents in the framework of historical materialism. And during different times, the party would attach different labels to the same groups. In other words, it called different groups different classes. And the group boundaries were drawn again and again arbitrarily. You'll see what I mean when I show you a table later. The boundaries were really very easy to change and to overstep, and re-evaluated class consciousness again and again. It's another party's decision. The party also devised different class schemes using practical scanning mechanisms. It's a process where peasants were sorted into opposing camps, friends and enemies, on the basis of two things in the main. One is the ownership of land. The other is not mentioned very often. It's the use of land. So it's not purely land ownership, but it's how is the use of land as well. And the camps were divided further into groups or strata on a gradational scale. So landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, lower middle peasants, poor peasants, and tenants, and so on and so forth. And the meaning of exploitation changed frequently as well. Now, Mao made, I think, drew at least three class maps. And this one is particularly noteworthy because it was later accepted by the party and implemented. So according to this map, there are 5 classes, rural classes: landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants, agricultural workers. Yeah, and he went to went to extreme lengths to explain what the landlords included, why they were classified as landlords. Exploitation is was one of the criteria, and what did exploitation actually meant. So there's a lot to go through. The second stage, the peasantry during Mao's socialist transition. The meaning of the class and the role of this class changed quite dramatically. Now, there is a striking feature about the peasantry as a class. That is the divergent status in the polity and in the economy. On the political side, politically, peasants were elevated in the PRC status order and represented as the masters of the country together with the industrial workers. And yet, economically, they were subjected to the imperatives of PRC's socialist industrial development and treated very much as a reserve cheap labor force, which could be drawn into the cities when necessary, or sent back to the villages when the demand for cheap labor in the cities decreased. An important thing to remember and to mention is the household registration system. I'm sure you're all familiar with HKU. 2 points to be highlighted is actually the functions of HKU. It was meant to ensure that access to comparative advantages in the cities and countryside were not freely available to all individuals in the PRC, but they must be distributed by the party state, by government departments and agencies of the state. The second function was the provision of food, housing, education, medical care, and social welfare, right? But in terms of class analysis, in terms of class formation, HKU played a critical role, even a pivotal role, because it is HKU which defined the peasants' official class identity. Whereas other things like occupation and residence didn't really matter, because you are a peasant if you have rural HKU, simple, even if you are not a farmer, even if you didn't work in the fields. And the class membership of the peasants would not change even if they moved into other occupations. Once again, if they didn't change the HKU, household registration. So the two things, land ownership and hukou really had the effect of underpinning the peasants down to the land and locking them into officially designated classes. The party said it was going to get rid of the urban-rural distinction divide gradually. But what it did in the 1950s and 60s was actually the opposite. It maintained and hardened the urban-rural distinction during the first 3 decades of the PRC. Right? So as a consequence of that, the Chinese peasantry was not going to sink into the proletariat during the socialist transition. And the bulk of the class did not. As Marx and Engels predicted would happen in advanced stages of capitalism. How am I going for time, Kam? I forgot when we started.
No, you're doing well. No. We still plenty of time.
Thanks. I'll try to hurry up a bit.
No, you still got 10 minutes.
Oh, good. So the peasants' role in the economy was dictated not by objective class conditions or the mode of production to be found in Chinese society. It's actually dictated by the party's social transition or policy, particularly the socialist industrialization. So what does that say about Marxist class analysis? And what does it say about objective class conditions? Well, you all know that the government's development policy from the 1950s all the way to the 1970s prioritized industry, especially heavy industry. Now, agriculture was subordinate, and agriculture farmers were expected, in fact, were made to contribute to industrial development. Agriculture contributed nearly $500 billion to industry between 1954 to 1978. 500 million yuan is not a lot by today's standards, but when poor farmers are just growing wheat and not very fertile land, is a lot of money in those days, right? Roughly about 22 million peasants migrated to urban areas in 1954 alone, and that's the year when industrialization began to accelerate. 32 million went to the cities in 1958. That is when the Great Leap Forward happened. The proportion of the rural labor force in the national total was just under 60% during the Great Leap Forward, right? And 82% in 1962. That's a big contrast, isn't it? It shows you that, all right, if the government wanted cheap labor from the countryside, peasants would be encouraged to come in. When there's no work available, then they will be asked, or in fact, required to go back to the villages. Yeah. Finally, during the year, the peasantry during the post-Mao reform and opening up, right? And I keep on saying this all the time, certainly to my students at the University of Sydney. I repeat myself because they don't remember or they don't pay attention to it. And I kept saying to them, reform and opening up actually abandons class struggle. If you abandon a class struggle, you actually abandon the Chinese Revolution, because the Chinese Revolution is class struggle. Consequently, the peasant class, like the proletariat, is detached from the CCP's historical mission. It doesn't have a central place in the political scheme of things anymore. Right? They are neither the principal subject of the revolution nor collective owners of the people's democratic dictatorship. That's how the PRC is still defined. And the question is, in what way are the peasants and industrial workers still the collective owners of that dictatorship? Instead, the peasants are treated as objects of urbanization and consumers whose purchasing power can be enhanced if they are relocated. And that's why the party has had a new urbanization program. Another thing is, of course, this notion that a modern society has to be an urban society where the urban population exceeds a certain percentage. Social scientists in China tell the government officials that, and the government officials have bought that argument. The political decline of the peasantry has more notable implications for the PRC's polity, because, well, as I said, is that still a people's democratic dictatorship? Is the PRC still a socialist country led by the industrial workers, aligned with the peasantry? So what does that actually mean? The decline, yeah, it's attributable to the new urbanization program. What does the program do? It has very consciously ramped up China's urbanization, not simply by setting quota or transferring rural population to urban areas, but also by reforming hukou more drastically than any other time in the PRC. Right? So what you see in the PRC is very different from what you find in a typical capitalist society. Urbanization here is not the handiwork of the bourgeoisie alone. It's not simply the bourgeoisie which has subjected the country to the rule of towns, created enormous cities, and greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, as Marx and Engels predicted to happen in capitalist societies. What is happening in China is actually a result, or urbanization is a result of the collaboration between the CCP and capitalists. They together have brought about very rapid and massive urbanization. Now, they have a common goal to share. They have a shared common goal, and that is greater assumption. I can go on with a fair bit of analysis, but I won't. I think it is within the time I have, it's good enough to give you one quote from Premier Li Keqiang, who said, "Urbanization is the largest generator of domestic consumption. It creates enormous supply chains and consumption chains. The renovation of shanty areas in the cities and the purchase of furniture, white goods, and other household items by peasants living in urban areas are massive needs. Even the needs for security guards, domestic workers, and restaurateurs create considerable employment." So consumption. As a result of the government's urbanization program, population changes have taken place. The percentage of the PRC's agricultural labor force in the national total dropped from roughly 70% in 1978 to about 43% in 2019, a bit further in the last couple of years. Not much, but a bit further. And the rural population went down from 82% to 39% in the same period. It's a dramatic change by anybody's standards. By the end of 2019, China's urban population had reached 848 million. That's over 60%. So the government and the party could claim, yeah, China has become an urban society. And this is going to continue because the government has pledged to achieve 70% urbanization in terms of population composition by 2030. And the whole urbanization program will be fully completed by 2035. Finally, just a few concluding remarks. So what is happening? Where is this all going? The class condition in the reform era is characterized by the combination of state-protected land use rights and the collective ownership, right? This is what I see. The combination precludes the possibility of peasant class in the countryside evolving the same way as in Marx and Engels' ideal type of capitalist societies. In other words, you will see a very different trajectory of class formation in the PRC from what you see in the typical capitalist society. That's not surprising, right? You have a Chinese Communist Party, you have a hybrid economy, which is not really capitalist, but is certainly not just socialist either. And another consequence, another trajectory is that the peasants are not likely to sink into a landless class of poor peasants or rural proletariat, as many did before 1949. So the collective land ownership and the individual farmers' land use rights will protect them. So that's a good thing, you argue, right? And the combination has given rise to a class of rural migrant workers with distinct Chinese characteristics. So this social category is probably not something you see in any other society, because in terms of class analysis, this class has dual class membership. On the one hand, they can still be considered as peasants, but they can also be considered as a new industrial proletariat, a new industrial workers. Now, it really depends on whether their hukou changes or not. And it's probably not possible to see, it's not likely going to happen that some rich peasants will evolve into rich landlords, right? Given there's no private land ownership. But it does not prevent the emergence of a new class of rich peasants or urban and rural capitalists who amass land user rights from individual households, individual farmers, even if they don't own the land. So the government is allowing more operators to do that. You can sign a contract with farmers so that you will use their land user rights and develop new agribusiness or other things. So that's going to happen. You'll have probably not landlords, but rich peasants. You also have urban capitalists gradually come into rural areas. Finally, whatever happens, the PRC's polity as the people's democratic leadership has changed and is going to change further. And that's going to make it necessary for the party to change, to amend the constitution of the PRC. Whether it's going to do that or not is a question. So I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to questions and comments.
Thank you, Yingjie. That's really fascinating presentation. I'm sure that some people in the audience would want to ask questions or have comments, and as I said in the chat, please put them in the Q&A panel, and we'll try and address them. But before anyone asks anything, can I ask Yingjie, you talk about Foucault as being a determinant, actually, whether the peasantry is going to survive in any kind of way. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think the Foucault system will disappear fairly soon? The way that the peasantry is shrinking, is in many ways there's really no need for.
I think you're right, Kam. It's already disappearing. Yeah. And the Foucault reforms in the last 5 to 10 years have dramatically changed the situation on the ground. So it's much easier now for rural Foucault holders to get urban Foucault. The control over cities with fewer than 3 million people is already free. You can, in theory, although local governments are still making it difficult for individual rural Foucault holders to get a foothold in the cities. And many farmers actually don't want to give up the rural household registration.
That's right,
they can use the land use rights.
Yeah, that's the impression I got too, talking to some of them back in the village. But if that's the case, if the Foucault system disappears, what the CCP would lose one of its major population control tools. So do you think that they're likely to go with the flow, as it were, to go with the way the population is going to happen, where they'll, or do you think they'll use some other population control measures? Because it's a very effective mechanism, as you sort of pointed out.
There is less need for population control now, I think. Right? So rural migrant workers can come into the cities. Most of them can't settle anyway because they can't find to buy or rent. So they are very much seasonal migrant workers. They come to do some work, earn some money, and go back. Only a few can manage to actually settle permanently in the cities.
Right. Yeah.
The need for control is less now because, all right, if they run out of work, they can always go back to the villages, which is why the government doesn't want to privatize land. It doesn't allow private ownership. So that safety net is still there.
Okay, great, thanks. I see there's